Audio check. Okay, it's 2 o'clock, so we shall resume. Before we kick off, there's a couple of points. Looking at the timetable, we're not going to get to Mr. Vaughan today. I assume, sorry, Mr. Vaughan. We'll get through the, hopefully, the cross-examination, so we'll have to move things forward and sort of see how that pans out. We have got a little bit of flexibility next week. Mr. Morehouse.
I clearly don't know how long Mr. Humphreys is likely to be with Mr. Vaughan, but I suspect that we will be adopting a lot of the evidence given already, so it will be probably a lot quicker than anticipated.
Thank you, that's helpful. Thank you.
Madam, yes, I was going to say that I think certainly with Mr. Vaughan, I would anticipate being very much shorter than I think was originally estimated. Remember, the estimates were from weeks ago. Yeah. And
I think you estimated an hour and a half for Mr. Vaughan.
Yes, it won't be anything like that. For Mr. Vaughan rather than Mr. Fumicelli.
Yeah.
Won't be anything like that, so that's good. And I can't remember what I said now exactly for Hilary Byrne, but again, we're dealing with part of the evidence. Again, I will try and take that much shorter. I think for Mr. Fumicelli, I said 3 hours, and that is realistic. Of all the estimates I've made so far, that's the only one I think that I could go longer. Everything else I've been shorter. It just depends how Mr. Fumicelli and I kind of get along with certain things, but there's a lot to cover and quite a lot has changed and so on. So I'm sure we'll both do our best.
Okay, we'll see where we get to today, but yeah, okay, thank you for that. We've had the map of the parishes from the PCAA, so thank you for that. We were chatting over lunch. It's been mentioned today, and it was mentioned last week. Yep. I think in the forecasting section about coordinated status of Bristol Airport. Neither of us have seen anything in the evidence to explain what that is, particularly. So we wondered whether we could have a short note, just setting out what that is. I know that there isn't a live application from Bristol Airport, it was withdrawn, but just to actually explain to us what it is, because it's come up a couple of times now, and obviously the witness today wasn't in a position to answer that, and I don't know who is, but...
we can certainly do that. So I'll just give you the sort of 1 minute, 30-second potted version. There are both some EU regulations which are part of retained EU law, so they still apply because they were regulations, not directives. And there are some UK regulations that apply to slot allocation and coordination. Bristol Airport, and there are 3 levels, 3 being the highest. Bristol Airport is a partially coordinated airport, so during the night time, because it has to administer the QC system, it is allocated slots, are allocated under that system, and the system generally involves a series of rules, including grandfather rights, but capacity declarations, local rules, things like that apply under these slot allocation regulations. It's not coordinated during the daytime period, and that's because it hasn't been congested. These rules apply where airports become congested. That's why pre-pandemic they had applied, because they were about to become a congested airport, i.e. close up against their planning limits. Obviously, with the pandemic, that receded. But this is not, this is something that would be expected to be granted. Those are powers there for airports that that become congested. We'll produce a short note for you that explains the current rules as they apply to Bristol and what we anticipate in the future, and sort of outline the rules. In fact, if you go on Bristol Airport's website, I think there's quite a good page or series of link pages on what happened and what these types of rules are for the public and others to look at.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Taylor.
It's the point that I've been pushing at about the slot coordination process is that, as for example, Mr. Lees, who's the chief executive of Bristol Airport Limited, explained to the Airport Consultative Committee recently, is that without the coordinated process, without slot allocation, the airport wouldn't have the ability to fully control the demand for flights and passenger numbers that's necessary to be able to comply with the contour condition. And there's a whole load of law behind that basic approach, but certainly the way Mr. Lees explained it to the Consultative Committee sits alongside my understanding, which is that the application for coordinated status was made to give the airport control over the timings and numbers of flights. Without that, there's a process called you become what's called a schedules facilitated airport, where there is a facilitator who looks at the slot process, but they can only make a recommendation to an airline as opposed to insisting what type of aircraft or what slot an airline has. So there's quite an important point at stake in this particular issue, and certainly we're quite happy to provide our views in a note on that element as well, if that would assist.
Yeah, okay. I mean, I think we need firstly the factual sort of what it is, not being sort of fully. We kind of guessed at what it meant, but just to have that, and then we'll look at sort of the implications. I think, Mr. Humphreys, did you want to come back or?
No, there's no great point prolonging the debate now. As you say, I think you just need to know the facts. Obviously, there is an existing contour cap at this airport, and it's operated perfectly acceptably within that cap. But let's not prolong it. We'll produce a note for you.
Okay, thank you. I think before we see it, if you can share it with the other parties, just and then we'll
do our best to agree it if we can.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, and then Mr. Fiumicelli, you were very helpful in answering some of my queries earlier about what a QC system is and what an APU is. I just have a couple of questions. So again, we were musing over our lunch. So in terms of the APUs, so they're fitted to a plane, jet powered, so I've got that. Just in terms of the plug-in system, and it's probably an obvious question, but I like to ask the obvious questions just so it's right in my mind. So I presume they're much quieter, the airport's plug-in systems, as opposed to the jet APU. Is that correct?
Yes, yeah, correct. The APU doesn't have to run. It's like the difference between a car with the engine running to power the headlamps and with the engine turned off and it's running the headlamps off the battery. There's no substantial external source of noise on the aircraft to generate electricity. It's literally cabled in, and it comes from the main supply somewhere. It goes through whatever process it needs to. It obviously depends upon there being the infrastructure in the airport, there being the cabling runs, and then the outlets at each stand. There can be issues with them being installed and then they get damaged, aircraft run over and things like that. But that's a management issue that can be dealt with. There were relatively recently the stands at London City, for example, only a proportion of them had the cabling in, and they had to run aircraft on stands with APUs running, and it was a real issue. But now they've now cabled it. You can still have to have some aircraft will have to use their APU for all sorts of, they've got continental plugs and we've got British plugs, that kind of thing, kind of differences in. It's not that it's a much more robust and obviously complicated than that. But your core question, is it quite? Yes, it's effectively silent.
No, that's very helpful. Thank you, Mr. Humphreys. Sorry.
Yes, I'll just explain, Madam. The stands we're talking about have, as I understand it, they have electrical ground power. The point is, you have to get to the stand to use the electrical ground power, and at the moment, the aircraft are tow on, tow off. And although Mr. Fumicelli said, I accept slightly flippantly, well, this is about keeping your drinks cool. It's not just your drinks; it's the electrical systems that cool the plane. And so, unless they keep the engine on, or auxiliary power, they don't have cooling systems in quite that way. And so, what we're seeking to do is have the ability to use the APUs to get on to stand. Once they're on stand, they have the ability, subject to the point Mr. Fumicelli's made about compatibility of aircraft, which isn't, can be an issue. They can use electrical ground power.
Okay, thank you. And then with the QC system, again, I got it. It was a very clear explanation with the budgets and the 0.5s and the 2s, etc. You then talked about 3 decibel banding, and there's an agreement to reduce it to a 1 decibel banding, and just sort of trying to join the dots as to how that all fits together. If you could just explain what that means for the QC system, please.
What it means is the QC system has got a lot more resolution to it. So instead of going sort of, 1.5, 1.5, 2.25, 0.125, it will go 1.75, 0.5, whatever the half between half and 125 is. It's a much more granular, finer resolution. It's done effectively on a one. The budget value is a halving each time there's a 1 decibel difference in the loudness of the aircraft, rather than it being 3 decibels. So the difference between the top and the bottom of any QC band is a maximum of 1.9 decibels, whereas if you use the 3 decibel band, difference between the top and the bottom is 5.8. So that's quite a big difference in the relative loudness of 2 different aircraft types, but they will be classed in the same QC. Whereas if you use the 1 decibel bands, you're refining it a lot more. It's a lot tighter.
So it's a precision, it's more precise. Yes, it avoids the problem of you potentially having 1 aircraft being allowed to in the same QC group. That allows it to be to have twice as many within the budget. But actually, it's impossible to detect any real difference in how loud it is compared to the QC band above. It makes that much more difficult less likely to happen. You can't eliminate it. You have to have a boundary between the different bands somewhere. It was introduced initially for nighttime issues at the designated airports at Heathrow, Stansted, Gatwick. As I said, it's been used at London City during the day, which I think is the first time it's been used during the daytime. And then about 3 or 4 years ago, following on from them being granted permission to expand, it was decided to change the banding from 3 to 1 decibel. And there was a broad agreement from all the stakeholders that this was to give better, as you say, precision and detailed control over which aircraft could and couldn't fly in and out of the airport. Okay. thank you. That's very helpful. Mr. Humphreys.
What I was going to say is I can sort of, if you can bear just going to a document, I can show you what Mr. Fumicelli means by reference to the existing planning permission, because that's what he's talking about.
Yeah.
So if you had document CD 4.1b, and you 4.1b, and you turn to PDF page 21,
Yeah.
you will see the existing night flying condition, which is 36. Do you see that?
Yeah.
And if you just scroll on a couple of pages to PDF page 23, you will see the bands and
Yeah.
the quota counts. So what the point that Mr. Fumicelli is making is those bands are 3 dB bands. Do you see?
Yes, I
And,
do,
and
yeah.
each one has a number. And what he's saying is if we made the bands smaller, then the difference in noise for each aircraft that would be within the same band would be
Yeah.
constrained. That's
Yeah.
the point he's making.
Yeah, thank you. That's helpful. Okay, thank you. Yeah, okay. All right, I'll pass you over now then to Mr. Humphreys for cross-examination. Thank you.
Mr. Fumicelli, good afternoon.
Hi, hello, sir.
Mr. Fumicelli, you told us in your proof of evidence about your previous experience with airports, and those include, as you tell us at the bottom of the proof, Heathrow, and you're not talking there about Terminal 5, you're talking about the Cranford Agreement appeal.
Yes.
Where I think I was due to cross-examine you, and then I had another case, so we didn't meet that time. But the next one, London
No.
City, that one I did cross-examine you.
Yes.
And then Farnborough, where I didn't have that pleasure. But looking back at your previous proofs of evidence for objectors, many of the themes in your current evidence are familiar, aren't they? You have been critical of the use of 16 and 18-hour LAQs.
Yes.
And certainly at Cranford, you proposed that the threshold for significance in terms of change should be reduced to 1 dB.
No. At Cranford, I was quite careful to say that actually 3 was okay in those circumstances.
Okay.
Because that wasn't a proposal to change the number of air traffic movements. It was a proposal to move where the aircraft would fly.
Okay.
So there weren't going to be more aircraft, they were just going to be louder aircraft.
Okay, well, we have an extract from the inspector's report before us, which talks about the authority's position, but let's leave that to one side. It's fair to say...
Sorry, can I just go back? Sorry, on that point. Actually, I think my recollection is clearing slowly. I think we may have argued that where the noise level was high, that in line with the advice of the MPPG, where you have high noise levels, smaller changes in noise become significant. I think that was when I suggested that 1 decibel should apply. And I think that was for circumstances above the SOL value, much as is proposed in the ES and the AS here.
Yes. What we can record, though, that in all of those inquiries, the ultimate decisions were based on significance criteria set in terms of 16-hour and 8-hour LAQs for daytime and nighttime.
They form part of the decision-making process, yes.
Well, they formed part of the decision-making process, yes, obviously, but the significance criteria were based on those LAQ matrices, weren't they? Matrix, sorry.
Metrics. Yes, they were.
Yes. And insofar as you did propose reducing the difference contour at Cranford to 1 dB, and you're right, it was above a certain threshold, that was rejected.
Yes, I mean, the inspector basically, as I read it, said that because there wasn't specific guidance as to what was a high enough level to trigger it, he wasn't going to recommend it. Well,
all right. We can see what the inspector said. It's the appendix to Mr. Williams' evidence. Now, your involvement here, I don't think you or indeed Vanguardia were advising the council pre-determination of the application.
No, we didn't. No, I wasn't.
I hope it wasn't something I said.
Very polite question, I thought.
There's lots of bings on the lobby, so that's a good sign, hopefully.
Yeah, but we lost everybody. So.
But we... Hello.
I think I'm back.
Can you see us?
I can hear you, yes.
Excellent. Not sure what happened there,
got a-
slight technical hitch.
I got a message saying, you disappeared and I was cut off, and I got a message saying the meeting had gone on too long. That was the message. I'm not saying
Widely shared view.
and invited me to rejoin through the original link, which is what I've done.
Okay, well, yes, we're still here. It's not gone on too long, unfortunately, for you, so you don't get off scot-free this afternoon, I'm afraid. So
No,
I'll hand you back to Mr. Humphreys.
Mr. Humphreys has many more questions to ask me.
Mr. Fumicelli,
Sorry, sir.
don't worry at all. I'm glad you're back. Mr. Fumicelli, obviously at that time the council was advised by the aviation noise team at Jacobs. You're obviously familiar with that, I take it.
Well, I know that they've been providing information and advice in the run-up to the committee meeting.
Yeah, and they didn't disagree with any of the methodologies that the airport has used, and they advised on consistency with policy and in relation to mitigation. We can see the officer's report, so we can see in your evidence, can't we, that it departs from, different from the evidence that was given by the professional consultants leading up to the decision.
Yes, if I'd agreed with them, I wouldn't be here giving evidence on behalf of the council.
Of course. And that related not just to air noise, but also ground noise and road traffic noise. We can agree that.
Agree what, sir? That they'd advised the council?
That you differ from their advice. I suppose we could say on road
I
traffic
don't
noise
differ- I
we're
don't
agreed.
Sorry, I don't differ on traffic noise.
No, on road traffic noise.
I do differ to a degree on ground noise,
Okay.
and much more so for air noise.
Yes. You have, and don't take this as a criticism, but you have a lot of text very helpfully on policy, and you went through that in great detail this morning. And what I'm going to try to do is to kind of focus that by taking you to your paragraph 3.52, that's your page 27, where on page 27 and page 28, you set out 9 conclusions from policy. If you like, they're sort of themes that you derive from policy. So what I'm going to do is ask you questions about those themes. Okay?
Okay, yep.
So we're going to look at the first theme, the way that you've summarized national and local planning policy. And the first one is that the number of people in the UK significantly affected by aircraft noise is to be limited where possible, reduced. And that that particular theme of yours seems to be most closely based on the airport policy framework. So we'll just go to that to see what it says, if we may. So you need to have CD 6.1.
Got it open.
Have you got it? And we're going to go to page 11.
Yeah.
And it seems as though that theme, so we're just using this as a way to examine government policy. You can see the emboldened text. And the first point to make, and I'm not criticizing you for it, but just making sure the inspectors have got the context, that particular point is part of what is described as an overall objective, isn't it?
Yes.
It's a policy aim that obviously doesn't just relate to planning applications or expansion. It also relates, as we can see later in the same paragraph, to my shorthand, sort of incentivizing aircraft manufacturers and others to reduce noise from aircraft. Are you able to agree that?
It references incentivizing noise reduction and mitigation.
Yes. And it makes it very clear, apart from that being an overall objective, that objective is to limit and where possible, reduce. And we should note, therefore, that the where possible, that caveat, clearly recognizes that there may be circumstances where reduction is not possible. Is that fair?
Well, yes, yeah.
And clearly, a circumstance where it is not going to be possible to reduce is where one is looking at airport expansion and looking at a with and without development scenario at the same year in the future. Clearly, with development, with more aircraft movements is always going to be somewhat noisier than without.
Well, it depends on how noisy the individual aircraft get, less noisy the individual aircraft are.
Yes, but
and the second sentence of that paragraph says the document makes clear that the acceptability of growth in aviation depends to a large extent on the industry continuing to tackle its noise impact, and confirms government expects the industry at all levels to continue to address noise.
Yes,
So there may be circumstances where, not on that basis, okay, you want growth, but it means no noise. Well, actually, you shouldn't have growth.
yes, but the consequence of that, if that position was correct, which appears in more than one of your themes, is the consequence of that is one could never have airport expansion, because the with development in the same year would always be greater than the without development. And the point I'm putting to you is, because this is an overall objective, the words where possible reduce, clearly recognize that that may not always be possible. That's fair,
It
isn't
might
it?
not be, yes, but then again, there's the degree to which you push. What's possible isn't just merely a technical issue, is it? There are the economic drivers for this as well.
Yes. And we know from elsewhere in this document that this is a document that has a policy that supports making best use of existing runways. And therefore,
Where you limit and where possible reduce the number of people significantly affected by aircraft noise.
yes, Mr. Fumicelli, but I'm trying to get you to just focus on this point where possible. Where possible, if you add a number of aircraft movements and you have the same or very similar aircraft in the with and without case, because it's the same year, with is always going to have some more noise than without, as night follows day.
That would therefore, unless there are other overriding reasons, fall foul of this requirement to where possible reduce noise,
Yes.
or even simply the issue, the point to limit noise. I mean, limit as I read it in this is no worse than it is under the current permitted situation or something like that. Not limit to some future level that allows you to grow and produce more noise.
Yes, and if we want to see this point in action about limiting noise and growth, if we turn to page 60 in the document.
Page 60 was that? 160 was that?
60, please. And we look at paragraph 3.24.
Yeah.
The acceptability of any growth in aviation depends to a large extent on the industry tackling its noise impact. The government accepts, however, that it is neither reasonable nor realistic for such actions to impose unlimited costs on industry. Instead, efforts should be proportionate to the extent of the noise problem and the numbers of people affected. So again, a recognition, isn't there, that it may not always be possible to reduce, and also a recognition that effort should be proportionate.
Yes, that's what it says.
And back in the text that we were looking at before, on page 11, which is where you've got your first theme from. So paragraph 17 again, talked about the overall objective. We've talked about where possible reduce, and we note also that the where possible reduce relates to the numbers of people significantly affected, and therefore there's clearly also a level of judgment there about significance.
Yes.
So let's just then discuss, we'll perhaps stay in the same CD, don't change that, but back in your proof, the second of your themes future growth in aviation should ensure that benefits are shared between the aviation industry and local communities. This means that the industry must continue to reduce and mitigate noise as airport capacity grows. As the noise level fall with technology improvements, the aviation industry should be expected to share the benefits from these improvements. So let's just explore that and see where that comes from. So again, in the APF, this time let's turn to page 55. Do you have that?
Yes.
And this is the point, I think Mr. Taylor certainly referred to some of these things. We want to strike a fair balance between the negative impacts of noise on health, amenity, quality of life and productivity, and the positive economic impacts of flights. As a general principle, the government therefore expects that future growth in aviation should ensure that benefits are shared between the aviation industry and local communities. This means that the industry must continue to reduce and mitigate as airport capacity grows. So again, we need to note, of course, don't we, that this is not hard and fast. Those important words that don't appear in your bullet point, but the words as a general principle the government expects. Important to note that, isn't it? Can you hear me?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I can. I'm just reading through it.
Of course.
Yeah, that's the golden thread that runs through, isn't it? The general principle. Yeah.
Yes. And again, a recognition, isn't there, that this is not always going to be possible.
I'm not sure. If you read on to the next sentence, it says this means that the industry must continue to reduce and mitigate noise as airport capacity grows. The word must, I think, is quite directive there. It's not, if it can, if it feels like it, or maybe whatever, it's must, is what it says.
Okay.
Continue to reduce and mitigate noise.
Let's just explore whether this is some hard and fast rule or whether it's a general objective. Turn to page 60.
Am I the best witness to do this with, sir?
Well, you're the witness. You are the witness
policy
that had a large section 3 on these things. You're the witness that went through a lot of these things on your evidence in chief. You're the witness who produced the summary points here. So, it seems to me you are an appropriate witness to explore what the policy says.
I accept that. I'm not the best, but maybe I'm appropriate. Yes, okay, thank you.
That's, Mr. Fumicelli, very, very fair of you. I mean, if there's anything where, you really feel that you can't answer, of course, say,
obviously, I will, yeah. I mean, carry on, sir.
I've never known you to be shy in these regards, so, I travel in expectation, though. Mr. Fumicelli, turn to page 60 again, and this time paragraph 3.28.
I've got it.
And again, just taking really up the theme here, the government expects, 328, the government expects airports to make particular efforts to mitigate noise where changes are planned which will adversely affect the noise environment. Again, a clear recognition that there may be changes which will adversely impact the noise environment. There's not a ban on that, just an exhortation to seek to mitigate. Would that be fair?
Well, I think that it describes it as being particular efforts to mitigate, is that you need to go above and beyond. This would be, it goes on to say, particularly relevant, in specific circumstances.
Yes.
And helpfully it says at the end that it lists circumstances, and the main one at the end of that middle sentences is, or wherein increasing movements is expected, which will have a noticeable impact on local communities. That's the thrust of my evidence. There is a noticeable impact.
Yes, but that's exactly the point, isn't it? That this isn't a policy document which is saying you cannot have an increase in movements if there is an adverse effect. It's seeking to urge, where possible, limitations and reductions.
Well, no, we then go back to the overarching objective, which is
Correct.
the limit. I mean, the limit to me suggests that actually it should be no worse than is actually permitted, than is authorised or permitted at the moment. That's not to say that how the airport operates at the moment, but what permission it might have.
Well, that's actually
That's the
an
limit,
important point, isn't it? So, is it better than what is currently authorised? And it's a theme that perhaps we'll come back to, and we know what is authorised. That's in the 2011 planning permission.
Yeah, is that to go to 10 million? Yeah, sorry.
Yes, okay.
10 MIPA, as people have been calling it.
And insofar as in your bullet 2, it's back on page 55 again, paragraph 3.3, that fair balance and sharing benefits that sharing of benefits obviously has to have regard, as you've just told me, to what is currently permitted.
Yes.
And perhaps we'll come back to it much later, but there is a currently permitted noise contour, isn't there?
I managed to confuse myself on that point. I'd have to say yes to that. Yes.
I mean, there is, but don't worry, we can always come back to it. Okay, so let's then just look at your third theme. And here you've taken up a theme slightly along the lines of some of the answers that you gave this morning and that you've given to me, which seems to be, with respect, slightly absolute. You say aviation growth is only acceptable when noise is reduced and residual effects mitigated. Now, only acceptable where reduced, I can't find any policy basis for that. It's certainly not in the passages above that we've looked at in the APF. They're all nuanced and have things about general objectives and where possible, and seem to accept there may be more noise. Are you able to point to anything where there is an absolute prohibition of that sort?
Well, yes, where there's an unacceptable impact in the advice, the guidance within the MPPG, and then there's a broader statement.
Just take me to that. Which bit are we looking at?
It's in I have it as being paragraph reference 00. It's in paragraph 3.46 of my proof of evidence.
3.46.
And I reference paragraph 02002, reference ID 30-002-201-90722.
Okay, so let's look at
Of
that.
MPPG.
The MPPG states that noise can override other planning considerations with the qualification that where justified, although it is important to look at noise in the context of the wider characteristics of a development proposal, its likely users and its surroundings, as these can have an important effect on whether noise is likely to pose a concern. That you may, is that what you meant?
I think so, yeah, and yeah, not I think, I do. You know, for example, if you were generating noise in a location where there were no sensitive receptors, that would in the context of that situation, that would be acceptable.
All right. Well, that's helpful that you've pointed to what it rather you rely on for that third point. I have to say, I'll just suggest to you, and you can tell me I'm wrong, but I have to suggest to you that that passage doesn't seem to support your third theme, but that's, I understand that's what you're relying on.
Sorry, sir, was that a question?
Well, I was just checking with you that is what you're relying on. I was just putting to you that appears to me not to support your third proposition, but I'm just giving you an opportunity to tell me that there's something else. Fumicelli, I don't want to
I'm just going through my evidence, because it's a summary of the preceding elements of the document where I'd summarised policy, where I describe elements of policy, and I was rather hoping to find something in there that I could direct you to. Again, I think it comes back to the key phrase within the APF, the overall objective to limit and reduce where possible.
Okay.
My view is that it sets a cap or where we shouldn't go beyond, and that we therefore should be looking to reduce the noise impacts.
Okay. Understood. We obviously differ on the interpretation of policy, but you've helpfully
thank you.
Outlined where you got that point from. 4 is the worst unacceptable effects of noise on its own that remain, despite mitigation, must be prevented. And this, as I understand it, this point is based on the noise exposure hierarchy table. This is the UAEL in effect, isn't it? The prevented.
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yes, it is. Yeah.
And I don't know whether you've been given it. We had in the CD documents the relevant bits of the NPPG, but in the MPPG you click through to get to the hierarchy table and you can't click through on the PDF. So I had it reproduced, which I think is now a CD. But if you don't have it, it's in Mr. Williams' proof. I know you'll be very familiar with it, but do you have that noise hierarchy table as a separate document?
I don't. I've got it on my screen in front of me.
You've got it on your screen, have you?
Yeah.
So I think your fourth point here, prevent, I think is based on the unacceptable adverse effect level, which is prevent. So we know above the SOL, the policy action is avoid. We'll probably come to that later. But above the UAEL, it's prevent. And there's a difference between those two, isn't there? Prevent and avoid.
Yeah, there is. It would be redundant to not have those two distinguishable categories,
Yes.
Unacceptable adverse effect and significant adverse effect, and not have a difference, although
Yes.
it's quite subtle.
So above that level, effects are unacceptable and they have to be prevented. And the way for different types of development, but including airport developments, that would happen is typically one would assist people with the costs of moving, or occasionally I think properties are even compulsorily acquired, so that they cannot be above that threshold. Do we agree there?
If you when you assess that in the context of a single metric, the 16-hour LEQ or the 8-hour LEQ at night, you look at the qualitative description of what is an unacceptable adverse effect. Some of those, in particular the sleep disturbance, or deprivation rather, could occur in locations outside of the policy point where the APF says airlines should offer financial assistance with movement, which is 69 dB at AEQ.
So, we'll come back to this, but you've come to a point that I was going to touch on later, but the policy set level for UAEL, unacceptable things where you would assist people with moving, is 69 dB for daytime.
Well, there is no stated policy level of UAEL.
All right.
Yeah.
But we can agree, can't we, that there are no properties above the 69 dB?
No, there aren't any. Yeah. Sorry. Yes, we can agree. No, there aren't any. Yes.
Okay. So going back to your theme 4, which, as we agreed, is based on the noise hierarchy table, and unacceptable effects must be prevented, although that may be a policy theme which is generally useful to understand. In fact, here, there are no properties above that threshold.
Above the threshold at which the airport would be expected to offer financial assistance in moving.
Yes.
That's not necessarily. There could be unacceptable adverse effects arising at different values of different metrics, in particular at night time and sleep disturbance.
Yes. We're probably at slightly cross purposes. I'm talking about unacceptable adverse effects and prevent in terms of the noise policy statement for England and PPG hierarchy. You're talking, I think, more generally, if I can put it like that, about whether effects are acceptable or unacceptable. Can we perhaps agree that much?
No, I'm not, sir. Sorry if I haven't made the point clear. I distinguish between a significant observed adverse effect on sleep, for example, as described in this table, which talks about sleep disturbance in terms of resulting in difficulty getting to sleep, premature awakening, and difficulty getting back to sleep. Those are the significant adverse effect of noise on sleep, right? And they will happen at a lower level than you will have the unacceptable adverse effects on sleep, for example, which are described in the next row down, which talks about regular sleep deprivation and awakening.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the inspector should understand that what you're doing in your theme 4 here is you're taking the hierarchy table and the UAEL line in that, and you're applying it to, not to those absolute thresholds that we'll come to later, but you're applying it to something slightly different, to sleep disturbance and things of that sort.
Yeah, all the policy and guidance, and it's explicit in things like the MPSC, avoid stating a level that is to be regarded as a LOL, a SOL, or a UOL, because you can't do that. You can't have a single unifying number or metric that does it. These descriptors provide you with, these are the effects that should be considered as being significant observed adverse effect or an unacceptable adverse effect. When just taking the impacts on sleep, it's a significant adverse effect on sleep if people have got trouble getting to sleep, or awake early, or getting back to sleep if they're woken up. It's an unacceptable adverse effect if they are being sleep deprived, or they are awoken. It strikes me as being quite clear that there are gradations of effect here.
All right. Well, that may be an area useful to identify where we're not aligned. Your theme 5, this seemed to be the one then that was, in effect, summarizing the line above in the in the hierarchy. So this says significant adverse effects should be avoided, and that's the line where we can see we're above the SOL, and present and disruptive. We've got the descriptor there, the effect, and the policy action, the policy response that's expected there is avoid.
Yes.
Yes, and typically that's the level, isn't it, at which noise insulation, for example, is provided.
No, these effects that are described in that hierarchy table can occur at levels below statutorily prescribed thresholds for noise insulation, for example.
All right. And what I think this is illustrating is this difference between us, whereas Mr. Williams has applied the thresholds as they've been applied, I think, in many planning inquiries. If necessary, we can come to that planning decisions and we'll look at the policy. Your view, and it's one I've sort of heard you express before, is that one shouldn't rely on those particular levels, that in some way these policy responses are expected at much lower levels of noise.
Well, I take you to evidence to show that these effects that are described in this table will occur below for example, the APF's recommendation that airports offer financial support for noise insulation at 63 dBLEQ throughout the day, the 16-hour period. There's lots of circumstances where these effects will be happening at levels below 63.
And then your bullet 6, is in effect the hierarchy table in relation to Lowell. So you've summarized it shortly there, but we can see in the table, and we can go later to the noise policy statement for England to see what it actually is. But this is where things are above a Lowell level, and there's an observed adverse effect, and the policy response that's expected is mitigate and reduce to a minimum. And I think, in effect, that's what your theme 6 is kind of getting at.
No, that theme 5, that was, you just described part of my thinking about theme 5. Theme 6 is a potted summary of what the North Somerset, the NSC core strategy says in policy CS3.
I thought that was 7. 7 is harm to amenity. 6
Sorry,
was...
my numbering has got out of order.
Don't worry at all. I wrote big numbers next to each
1,
of
2,
them.
3,
Remember,
5.
there's 1 on the previous page.
There is, which I haven't counted. Thank you. Sorry. Yeah. No. Yes, Mr. Humphries, you're correct. The way what you just described in my thinking is a.
Yes.
I don't know if we need to do it again.
I thought it was 7. I think is where you base yourself on policy CS3.
Yeah, that's it. Because that's where amenities mentioned and and acceptable level, blah blah. Yeah.
Okay, and on. So we've distinguished which one we're looking at. Let me just finish 6. The adverse effect level. Can we just look at the noise policy statement for England, just to make sure that we've properly understood what that says. So it's CD 10.4.
Yep.
And so I've gone through the 3 of them. In CD 10.4, on PDF page 4, we get paragraph 1.7. We get the three aims, don't we? They're in a box on their own. Through the effective management and control of environmental, neighbourhood noise within the context of government policy, avoid significant effects on health and quality of life, mitigate and minimise adverse effects on health and quality of life, and where possible, contribute to improvement of health and quality of life. And then if we move on a little bit, we get the more detailed explanation of those. It's PDF page 9. We can see the first aim, which we touched on a moment ago, the second aim and the third aim. And it's probably important also to recognise, isn't it, that that each of those again is nuanced, is balanced, because as well as taking into account adverse effects on health and quality of life, it tells us we also have to take into account the guiding principles of sustainable development, which will include obviously economic development, economic health.
My recollection of the government, the point on this is that it's environmental, economic, and social.
Yes.
Aspects. It's not the commonly quoted rant kind of statement of sustainability. There's a very specific, definitive UK government statement of what that means.
Yes. The point I'm making to you is that the inspectors, when they're looking at these aims, again, need to understand from the noise policy statement that the aims, the 3 aims, are themselves tempered, aren't they, by the need to take into account sustainable development, including economic and social benefits.
Yes.
Now, bullet 7, as we were coming on to, is policy CS3. You've based yourself on that, and we've got that at CD 5.20. Let's just look that up. And I think in that we need to look at page 33. Do you have page 33 in the PDF?
Yes, I do.
And so the policy is development that on its own or cumulatively would result in air, water or other environmental pollution or harm to amenity, health or safety will only be permitted if the potential adverse effects would be mitigated to an acceptable level by other control regimes or by measures included in the proposal, by the imposition of planning conditions or through a planning obligation. So firstly, there needs to be a judgment about mitigation to acceptable levels, but also then, important in the planning context, a recognition that one should seek to control things by planning conditions. Is that fair?
Well, that condition can achieve your aim of mitigating to an acceptable level. Yeah.
Yes, and clearly here we recognise, we'll perhaps come on to it later, that there are a number of conditions that are proposed, aren't there, to cap the amount of noise.
Yes, there are conditions proposed, and we've been discussing them.
And as far as...
outside of the assumption that permission is granted.
Of course, but
Yeah.
that's obviously the context within which we would discuss conditions. There'd
Yeah.
be little point discussing them otherwise. And as far as acceptable level is concerned, as we were looking at earlier, that clearly reflects, doesn't it? What is acceptable reflects a balance, and that will take into account other things, including benefits, social and economic benefits of a proposal. Do you remember back from NPSE?
Well, that's not explicit within the core strategy, is it? One would assume that it has to operate within the overarching MPPF, which adopts the MPS and the NPSC. So yes.
Yes. And then 8 is quality of life shall be protected against adverse noise effects. And that one, again, I did look through all your policies and I was unsure of, there didn't seem to be any obvious definition of their quality of life shall be protected. Was there a particular policy you wanted to point to?
I think I was looking to distinguish the health and quality of life element of the MPPF and the MPSC, which refers to both, into two separate points.
So are those 2 points, 8 and 9, quality of life and health, are they intended to be saying anything more than what is set out in the 3 aims in the MPSE?
No, they aren't. They're meant to reflect what those aims are.
That's helpful, thanks. Well, that's taken us through those. The inspectors there, I've sort of taken policy in a slightly different way. You, in relation to the last of them, health, you didn't refer there to core strategy policy 26, CS 26. Was that any part of your thinking?
Sorry, I didn't quite catch that, Mr.
Don't worry at
Humphries.
all. In relation to that last bullet where you said to me you'd split out from MPSC quality of life and health, and I said, oh, are these two based on MPSC? And you said yes, and I said, you know, we can look at them.
Yeah, they are. They are. I mean, you've taken a slightly more forensic approach to the way in which I tried to summarise the previous summary that I reproduced in policy that I produced in detail. the last point is actually largely based on NSC core strategy policy CS 26, supporting healthy living and the provision of healthcare facilities.
Well, then let's just, for form's sake, just go back and look at that. So that's CD 520. So we would
yeah, it would be. It's also a reflection of what the MPSC and the MPPF say about where possible you try and improve health and quality of life. So what was the CD reference you gave again?
5.20.
520.
And it's page 102.
102 or 10? Yep.
And CS26 says the planning process will support programs and strategies which increase and improve health services through the district, promote healthier lifestyles, and aim to reduce health inequalities. And then it lists a whole number of ways in which that will be achieved. The first of them is requiring health impact assessments, and we know that we did that. I don't think any of the others are particularly relevant. There are ones to do with drugs and all sorts of other things. So again, does CS26 actually, does it add much?
What?
I mean, it seems to be about, well, lifestyles.
Well, point one is about, you know, the HIA will be required to demonstrate how it's going to contribute to improving the health and well-being of the local population.
Yes, but we have provided one, so I don't think there's any issue that we've provided one.
It just doesn't show that you're going to improve the health and well-being of the world population, though.
Yes, but
the local
it doesn't
population.
require that, does it?
Well, we'll have to agree to disagree on this one, sir, because yes, it does.
Okay.
You're requiring a health impact assessment on all large-scale developments. This is a large-scale development in a district that assesses how the development will contribute to improving the health and well-being of the local population.
Have you read the HIA?
Yes.
Yeah, and it does conclude that there will be benefits to health, doesn't it?
It makes the point, yes, there will be some socioeconomic benefits in terms of health.
Okay. Let's move on. So we've just, you know, light touch review of policy just to understand where the things that you've identified as being important come from. Let's talk now about metrics, so noise metrics. And we're going to start by just talking about the LAQ contours and their use as a primary metric. Let's just see what we can agree and maybe what we can't agree. We can certainly agree, can't we, that the LAQ contours are an appropriate matrix.
Yes, they're one of several.
Yeah. And are we able to agree that they are the primary metric for assessing significance of effects?
No, I struggle with this because the LEQ has, there are drawbacks with the LEQ. You know, as I state in my proof, there's no ideal single metric that covers all the issues that you want to address in terms of trying to assess the impact of noise, and that inevitably you end up having to use more than one metric, a matrix of metrics, so to speak. I don't agree that you should have one that's a primary metric that on your own fairly arbitrary developed significance criteria you decide, well, this is saying there is no significant effect we're therefore not going to look at anything else.
Okay.
I think you need to balance it and look at all of them with the appropriate metrics.
Mr. Fumicelli, I'm not surprised you said that. I've heard you say it before, which is not a criticism. But the inspectors need to understand, don't they, where you, if I can put it like this colloquially, where you come from on these issues. And where you come from is a position where you do not accept the use of the LAEQ contours as the primary metric.
It's the sole metric on which to make a decision.
Didn't say sole metric. I said primary metric.
No, I don't think they are sufficiently robust to be able to decide that they should trump. I mean, I hope we're both using the word primary in the same sense, but the way it's been used in this ES is if the assessment of the LEQ metric based upon the significance criteria, which I am critical of, it says that the impact is not significant. That's it, end of. Don't bother going any further. And I think that's flawed. I think you should rather than going forward on the Mr. Williams' rebuttal, he says, now the way you should use it is that if it shows there were to be a potential significant effect, you do a cross-check by looking at other metrics, and on that basis you can potentially rule out there being a significant effect.
All right. Let's just see what various other reports have said about these things. So let's start with SONA 2014, and then we may need to update with the 2021 second edition. And I'll just say this. There are two reports that came out a couple of weeks ago, whenever it was, from SONAR. I think one has been added as INQ 022, and that was the SONAR report on sleep disturbance. But they also brought out a second edition of the original SONAR 2014 report. So I'm going to go to the original report, but I may take you to the updated one, or the second edition as well, and then we'll look at the night one, so just so that people can kind of orientate themselves. So let's just look at the original SONAR report. So that's CD 10.9. Do you have that?
I do, yeah.
Great. And let's look at PDF page 65. This is in section 8. So section 8 is the summary, and it's the overall conclusions, and it has the study aims, and then it asks itself a series of questions, and it's exactly the same format in the one from a couple of weeks ago. So the first question on PDF page 65 is the LAQ 16 hour still the most appropriate indicator to use to estimate the annoyance arising from aircraft noise? And what it told us was the evidence was found that mean annoyance score correlated well with the average summer day noise exposure, LAQ 16 hour. There was no evidence found to suggest that any other indicators, L10, L70 or L65, correlated better. But then it explains the context for supplementary matrix. Having said this, the study recognized that residents can struggle to understand the concept of time average metrics, such as LAQ 16 hour, an LDEN, and the fact it's measured and reported on a logarithmic scale, point that you made, where a change of 3 dB represents a doubling or a halving. There is therefore merit in considering greater use of NX metrics as supplemental indicators to help portray the noise exposure, but recognizing that evidence-based decisions should continue to use LAQ 16 hours. So certainly sonar then, and we can look at whether they've changed this, but I don't believe they have, recommended, didn't they, the LAQ 16-hour contour as the primary metric and others such as NX as supplementary metrics.
Well, it doesn't use the phrase primary metric for LEQ. And I'm not saying you shouldn't use the LEQ. What my point is that the other metrics like the number above, the N70, the N60 in this particular case, are adequately correlated, and that they work in parallel, work together. I don't think that they're saying, they're not saying here that they describe them as supplemental indicators.
Yes. What they're saying, I think, fairly clearly is that what their fairly extensive work showed is that it was the 16-hour LEQ that was best correlated with the particular response, annoyance.
It is marginally better. Yeah, it has a slightly better R squared value, and the gap between the R squared value and the supplemental indicators has closed with the latest version when they've reworked the data. But that's the fact that the LEQ has, of those chosen indicators that were assessed, has the best correlation coefficient.
Yes.
Doesn't mean that it's ideal. It's not ideal. And there are still problems with the use of the LEQ, as alluded to in the APF and the other sort, the ANG 17 and the Aviation 2050, and the other indicators need to be used as well as the LEQ.
Yes, we understand the idea of supplementary matrices, but I think we can conclude that certainly what Sonar concluded back then, and we'll see what they say now, that it was better than anything else.
Yeah, I'm not saying you don't use LAQ. Yes, it is better than anything else. It's just not ideal. There are issues and problems with using the LAQ that you can cover off by using other indicators, which have their own drawbacks and disadvantages. No evidence in chief. We discussed the table in Cap 1736, and Mr. Williams refers to it in his rebuttal as well. I'm not disputing that yes, the LAQ has the best R squared, but it's not one. It's not ideal.
Well, a few things in life are absolutely ideal, but it's the best metric we've got. And if we if we look at trying to find the very latest
I think the language is almost identical from my recollection, but if you want.
Yes. If we look at the latest version of this report, so it's CAP 1506, second edition. I don't know, I don't have an INQ number for this because it was only the sleep disturbance one that went in. We've asked for it to be put in, so it could have gone on the...
Well, I'm getting a thumbs up from the back, so it should be
okay.
in the inquiry documents list online.
025, Brilliant.
the last one in the list.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Yes,
you.
025. I'm going to look at the copy that I've got. But
These,
025, INQ 025. Have you got it, Mr. Fumicelli?
I'm just going to it now.
Okay. Just let me know
I
when
managed to close my.
Don't worry. Let me know when you've got it. I don't want to rush you.
Yeah, I've got it open.
And again, if we go to section 8, that equivalent section, so this has all been updated now, so it's now PDF page 71. So the previous page 70 was study aims. Again, it's the same sort of format, it asks the same sort of questions. Is the LAQ60 now still the most appropriate indicator to use to estimate annoyance? And again, I'm not going to read it all out, but you can see paragraph 8.8. There was no evidence to found that any of the other indicators, L10, L70, L65, correlated better. Recognize people struggle to understand in 8.9, 8.10. Meriting considering noise above as a supplementary matrix. 8.12. Of the average day modes, the existing 92-day summer average was found to correlate better than shorter averages. So there was therefore no evidence found to support a change from the current practice of basing 16-hour LAQs on the average summer day.
Yeah, but
Mean annoyance.
yeah.
Mean annoyance scores and likelihood of being highly annoyed were found to increase with increasing noise exposure. And again, you know, we can go through all of this, but the findings are consistent, aren't they, with the original report?
Yeah, and I think, you know, what I would highlight is we go to paragraph, what is it? Sorry, I've lost it now. It's the one that talks. Yeah, paragraph 8. There is therefore merit in considering greater use of number of merits as supplementary indicators to help portray noise exposure, but recognising that evidence-based decisions should continue to use the LAQ 16 hours. That does not say you should only use the LAQ 16 hours.
No.
It's quite, you know, it's not eliminating use of other metrics, and it's not actually saying that LAQ should override everything else.
And N65 is preferred over N70 as the noise events in many areas are already beginning to occur at levels less than N70. DBA, LAS, i.e. slow, Max are forecast to reduce over time. We can see it endorses the point that you made this morning in 820. From the survey as a whole, 9% of respondents were estimated to be highly annoyed at an exposure level of 54 dB. That's exactly the approach, isn't it, that Mr. Williams has used?
In what sense? What, in calculating
numbers of people
Yeah, he's taken his exposed population and then he's multiplied it by the percentage from, that's fine. Yeah.
And, well, I probably don't need to take you to more on that one. So that's looking at, that's just looking at these contours and was looking at the daytime contours. If we do just look now at INQ 22, I think it is, the sleep report that came out a couple of weeks ago. Again, just worth, I think, just picking that up. And again, we can go to section 8, which I think is a little way in. Sorry, this document's so new, I'm afraid I haven't got all the PDF pages instantly to hand. So, yeah, section 8 again is the summary and conclusions from this report, and this report was produced, wasn't it, Mr. Fumicelli, because SONA 2014 was looking principally at daytime metrics, but it asked a lot of questions. It gathered a lot of data about nighttime, and what they've done is they've taken a lot of that data now and produced a second report looking at nighttime. So if we turn to PDF page 38, PDF page 38, we can see here the question, is the LAQ 8-hour an appropriate indicator to use to estimate self-reported sleep disturbance arising from aircraft noise? 8.9. All three indicators are highly correlated with nighttime self-reported sleep disturbance. For the R2, for L night, and you did pick this point up, I think, in your evidence in chief, but the L night is the LAQ, but averaged over an entire year, isn't it? Whereas the LAQ value is that value over the 92-day summer period.
Yes.
So, you know, as a generality, because most flights are concentrated into the 92-day summer period, typically you will expect the LAQ to be slightly higher than the L night, because that's an averaged over an entire year.
Yeah. And then because there's more movements.
Yes, but when you look at it averaged over an entire year, the average will be lower, and then that's why the L night's typically slightly lower, isn't it?
Yeah, that's why the correlation with the impact, which is driven by the worst effects, which are during the summer when there's the most aircraft.
Yes.
Yeah, that's entirely logical and to be expected. The L night would have a lower correlation coefficient.
Yes. Mr. Fumicelli, for the moment, the inspectors have got lots and lots of different metrics here. I'm just trying to make sure they've understood what they are. We can look at this in ICANN in a minute, but so 8.9 says the R2, so this is the correlation value for L night, was slightly lower than for LAQ. It's plausible that L night is inferior to the LAEQ 8-hour, as both Gatwick and Stansted airports experience significant seasonality with greater numbers of night flights during the summer months. Same with Bristol. L60 is found to correlate almost as well as LAQ and L night. Based on this exploratory analysis, there is insufficient evidence to change from the current practice of using the average summer night LAQ 8-hour noise exposure for UK assessment. So again, they've examined this quite closely, and the result is that we should be using, as we have, LAQ 8 hours.
As part of the assessment, yes.
Yes, and again, we can go all the way through this, but the overwhelming conclusion is that the metric that Mr. Williams has actually used at night time, the primary metric, the LAQ 8 hours, is the correct one to use. There's no research or policy basis to say otherwise.
But there are still issues with the use of the LAQ 8 hour at night. Yes, this is an assessment and a study based upon self-reported sleep disturbance. And as I said in my evidence earlier, you often find that the energy averaged over the whole night period does correlate quite well with those self-reported sleep disturbances. But when you look at a physiological level, when you look in detail at the impacts of noise at night, the indicators that describe individual noise events, things like the L Max, provide a better correlation. And that's important to consider. You can't just use one without the other, to be honest. You need to look at both.
Yes,
The overall energy average during the night period, and then you need to look at the number and distribution and pattern of individual noise events, as the MPBG says.
okay. So let's just, while we're still in this document, let's just pick up a slightly tangential point while we're here, and then we don't have to go back to it. If we just turn to PDF page 9, so we're still in the Sonar Sleep Report.
Yep.
And paragraph 218.
Yep.
So it says the WHO's view is that above 55 dB L-night, noise is a significant concern for public health. As a result, WHO set an interim target of 55 dB L-night outside.
Yep.
For the longer term, it recommends that night noise exposure should be reduced below 40 dB L-night outside. It is explained that the interim target is recommended in the situations where the achievement of the NNG, the night noise guidance, is not feasible in the short term for various reasons. With present technology, achievement of 40 dB L-night target would require almost complete closure of all transport systems, including roads, railways, and airports.
Yep.
And that's a rather obvious reason, isn't it, why the WHO's long-term target is not an appropriate policy threshold in the UK, and indeed it's not adopted in the UK.
Well, there aren't any thresholds adopted in the UK, that's the whole point of the way that the NPSC and the NPF work. Yeah, you're right. The interim target would be a challenge in many circumstances anyway. That's not to say, though, that there aren't, as they describe, substantial health effects at 55 or above, or even above 40. They are there. The thing to consider here is why do the World Health Organization recommend 55 as a threshold for their interim target? It's to do with cardiovascular effects, not effects on sleep. And that's quite important, because if you look elsewhere in this document, there's a really interesting, try to be nerdy about it, way that they've looked at reported sleep disturbance, and what they find is a very significant step change in response at around about 50 decibels rather than 55, because this study is looking at sleep disturbance, not cardiac artifacts. And I'm trying to find the relevant images. There's a very helpful table. Yeah, it's on page 27, table 14. And you can see, you get there, that in the noise band 48 to 51 decibels, centered around about 50, you get a near doubling of the number of people reporting they're being sleep disturbed, and it plateaus. It kind of stays roughly at that same value. Noise level go up. If you scroll on onto page 28, there's a plot showing this. Figure 4. Figure 4 shows a rapid increase in the portion of the population reporting being highly sleep disturbed, centered around about 50 decibels, L-night, LEQ, 8 hours. And it nicely shows the plateauing above that level. So, I think there's a strong argument to make soul at night on this evidence alone, 50, not 55, because this is about sleep disturbance effects rather than cardiovascular effects.
Thank you for that. I'm just sort of slightly looking at my machine. For some reason, though plugged in, it's not charging, and I'm going to lose all PDFs. So.
Do you want to take a break? I mean, it's 20 to 4 anyway, so it's...
That is... Can you literally just give me a moment? For those watching on YouTube, this is the wonder of live TV. Let me just...
I've discovered that some of the sockets don't work. So
the curious thing is that one. It's suddenly working again. That one was working. Okay. Mr. Fumicelli, I do apologize. I think Dr. Evil on the other side of the room has has been trying to sabotage my technology. Thank you, Mr. Fumicelli. I do apologise. I did hear your response, and thank you for that. I just want to go on now and look at ICANN, which is CD 1047. And again, I'm still on this point about the metrics, and despite I understand your criticism of the metrics and your views, but just keen to draw your attention, the inspector's attention, to what various independent reports have said about these things. So if we start on page 6 in I think it's PDF page 6. PDF page 6 in the ICANN report, right at the bottom. ICANN's key findings and recommendations on noise metrics. Full version of our findings can be found in chapter 6, and we'll look at some of that. In summary, we propose that the LAQ-based metrics currently used for noise monitoring should continue, but we should recommend that supplementary metrics should routinely be published by airports to better reflect the way in which noise is experienced on the ground. This is the point about people not understanding logarithmic averages. Again, we'll come to the detail, but you'll obviously have read it before. It would be fair to say once again, wouldn't it, that ICANN themselves endorse the use of the 16-hour LAQ and indeed the 8-hour LAQ.
Yes, but they're very careful to say not exclusively or on its own. They do go on to discuss, for example, the key points you'd want a noise metric to cover for aviation. Bottom of page 6, which kind of reflects my description of the ideal noise metric, and there will be no individual metric that will cover all of these things that the ICANN say should be covered. LEQ doesn't cover all of them, so you have to use different metrics in conjunction, in tandem.
Yes, but we should know, shouldn't we? This is the report from the Independent Commission on Civil Aviation Noise. This whole document was a review of aviation noise metrics and measurement. So the whole purpose of it was to deal with this. It's July 2020. If we just turn to page, PDF page 25, we get the first of a series of tables that are helpful to the inspectors, aren't they? So table 1 looks at exposure time averaged and cumulative noise metrics based on LAQ. Do you have that page?
Yes.
And I'm going to just scroll down to the next page, and you can see at the bottom of PDF page 26 there's the LAQ 16-hour. Let's just see what ICANN says about this. What is it? It's the LAQT average over a 16-hour period. Conventionally, it's from 7 till 11 in the evening. What it does, when determined for the average summer day between 16th of June and 15th September, that's the 92 days, it's one of the main measures of aircraft noise impact. Weighting, yes, the frequencies in the sound have been weighted using a weighting. Presence in UK legislation policy standards appears in British standards, number given. Summer average day value appears in government policy on aviation noise management, reference is given. Metric has been used by the UK for examining aircraft noise since 1990. And then links to effects on annoyance and other health. Exposure response function exists between this metric and annoyance, and it's thought to have changed over time, although some ERFs exist for other effects. So once again, this obviously post-dated the original sonar report, but it's again very much indicating that this is an appropriate metric and one that has an exposure response function, and we looked at that in sonar, didn't we?
It does, but again, it's not ideal. There are gaps and disadvantages in using this metric that you can cover by using other metrics in parallel.
Yes. Well, we'll see what it says about other metrics, but over the page, I'm not going to read it all out, but it deals, the inspectors can note it and look, it deals with the LAQ 8 hour. And again, we can see what is said about it and its links to health and annoyance and so on. Towards the bottom of that page, L-night, I'm not going to go into this, but just so the inspectors have that note, so the LAQ, L-night is LAQ averaged over the period of 1 year, and we saw the comment before about airports that are busier in the summer will tend to have a lower L-night because it's averaged over the entire year. So that's that one. If we then table 2 starts on PDF page 32. We don't need to really spend very much time on this table. There's a third table that we will look at. So this one is exposure time average cumulative noise matrix, and you can see in the final column lots and lots of them, no formal dose response exists. Quota count is in there on PDF page 33. NNI on PDF page 34, this was the old noise and number index. It points to historic relationships, and that was the standard that was stopped in the late 1980s. And then let's go on to table 3, so PDF 38. So this is where we get to a lot of the metrics that you point to. And so this is ICANN's review of these. So LA Max, I'm going to look really at the last column to see what it says. Frequently used in noise disturbance research, some correlation found with sleep disturbance and speech interference. Strength of correlation unclear.
Well, I don't know what research they're doing there. There's a considerable body of research that shows a strong correlation with sleep disturbance.
Yes, but Mr. Fumicelli, this is the independent commission's work. This is a, very authoritative piece of research which was looking exclusively at matrix, and this was their findings. And the inspectors clearly should give some weight to this, shouldn't they?
They should, but they should also understand that this piece of work, this analysis here, hasn't been carried out by an academic who's researched it. I think Simon Kahn is the main author, and he's an acoustic consultant like me, but he's clearly missed the body of work that shows a strong correlation between LMAX and sleep disturbance. It's a physiological level where you actually measure it rather than asking people whether they sleep disturbed or not. There's the Basner work, there's the Elmenhorst work, there's a whole range of things that there's the assessment of additional maintenance that both myself and now Mr. Williams have done for this project.
Yes, Mr. Fumicelli, I do appreciate that you disagree with a lot of other people on these things. I think it'd be perhaps wrong to dismiss the report of ICANN as well.
I'm not dismissing it, I'm pointing out that phrase, strength correlation, is unclear. It might be to the author, but it's not to me or many others.
Look at the next box down, LA Max F for fast. Again, the final column, research tends not to differentiate between fast or slow response times. And if you look at the next one at the top of the next page, again, research tends not to differentiate between fast and slow response times.
Research might not, but the World Health Organization does.
And noise models obviously produce their results in in slow, sorry, don't they?
Well, the research that correlates LMAX with sleep disturbance, some of it's based on measurements, which use fast, some of it's based on modelling that uses slow. So that's why it's important that you match your threshold, LMAX, and that you're weighing against it, that you're using to assess it. They have to match. You either have to make a correction to one or the other, or use ones that are both using the same time weighting.
Okay. Well, we can come back and look at some of the sonar stuff on that. A bit further down, PDF page 39, N70, likely effects. There's some limited evidence linking to annoyance.
Well, it's the sonar study says it is adequately correlated.
But not as accurately as the LAQs.
No, but the LEQ is not perfect.
And N65, ditto, some limited evidence linking to annoyance. I assume your answer will be the same and my response will be the same.
Almost certainly, sir, yes.
And N60, assuming a 15 dB sound reduction through a partially open window, it can be related to advice in WHO community and noise guidance.
Yes, that recommends a level of 45 in the bedroom at night, no more than 10 or 15 times. And that translates, if you assume a 15 dB sound reduction for a partially open window, to an external value of 60.
And then the final one I'll take you to, just to see what the independent commission concluded on this. Page 41, PDF page 41, single event level, SEL. Some research done in the past in the UK, more research exists internationally, generally considered to have a weak correlation with annoyance and sleep disturbance.
I wouldn't comment on annoyance. Sleep disturbance, there is a correlation. Again, it's, we have this differential between single event metrics being better at correlating with measured and measurable physiological effects on sleep than the LEQ, and vice versa, or self-reported effects, where the LEQ tends to have a better correlation.
It would be right, wouldn't it, when the inspectors are looking at all the evidence, for them to give considerable weight to this very recent report from the independent commission?
Yes, it's a valuable contribution to the information we have available. Was it published in 2018? I can't remember. Sorry, 2020. It is relatively new. It is a summary. It is a broad look at this. You do get more detailed review of this sort of thing through things like the information that supports the World Health Organization European Noise Guidelines from 2018. But yeah, this is certainly something that feeds into the whole process. And I particularly think at the beginning, under this section on our approach, it highlights just how there is no one single metric that will provide you with the best answer. You effectively have to use a matrix of metrics to cover off the weak points of each metric with another one.
And if we move...
Mr. Humphreys, can we have a break at some point?
Well, I suppose so, madam.
I don't have the power to turn off plugs or anything to insist on it.
Of course you can. I'm so sorry. I can't remember what time we're finishing today. Was this an early stop?
No, it's not an early finish
I think,
day.
are we going to aim for 4:30 as normal?
I'm happy to do it till 5.
5, okay.
So if we just have a 10-15 minute comfort break.
Yes, of course.
Yeah, okay, all right. So if we come back at 4:10 then, thank you.
Perfect.
Okay, if Mr. Fiumancelli's, there we go, as if by magic. Okay, Mr.
Aye.
Humphreys.
Mr. Fumicelli, so we're still discussing this relationship between the LAQ metric and now supplementary metrics. I just want to start touching on that relationship and supplementary metrics, and we'll come to some of those a little bit later. In your evidence, your proof of evidence at paragraph 6.9, you produce there a quotation from the Air Navigation Guidance 2017, a couple of paragraphs, as support for the use of the supplementary noise indicators. Do you see that?
Yes.
And what I want to do now is just take you to that document to just explore that in context. So we need to look at the Air Navigation Guidance 2017. That's CD 10.12. And I'm going to invite you to look at PDF page 18.
Yep. Okay.
And paragraph 3.5, I won't read all the way through it. I'm very happy that you scan through it, but it's about assessing airspace changes, and the very last sentence tells us, for the purpose of assessing and comparing the noise impacts of airspace changes, the government has set a lull of 51 dB LAQ 16 hours for the daytime and 45 dB LAQ for the nighttime, and the CAA should ensure that these are considered. So the first point I just wanted to touch on is this, that in the document, which you're relying on in your paragraph 6.9 for the use of supplementary indices, the guidance there starts with an assessment based on the 16 and 8 hour LAQs.
Yeah. And it says that these metrics should be considered. It doesn't
Yes.
necessarily mean that that's it. Stop. Don't do anything else.
We will come on to that, but that's where we start. And the lull there, both the daytime lull and the nighttime lull, those are the lulls that Mr. Williams has adopted, the 51 dB for daytime and the 45 dB for nighttime.
Yes.
Although, having quoted from this document, you don't agree with those, or at least you don't agree with the nighttime one.
No, yeah, I think there are in this case. There's it would be better to use a lull of 40 at night, and I've laid that out in my proof. It's because this is broadly a relatively quiet location. And the argument for 45 is that the accuracy of modelling starts to become questionable below 45. I mean, sorry, but we should be looking at the impacts, not the limitations of the modelling system.
And then what the text does over the succeeding few paragraphs, until we get to the paragraphs that you've quoted, is it talks about different height thresholds which are relevant to airspace design, below 7,000 feet and below 4,000 feet, and then we get to paragraph 3.11, which you have quoted. And we need to remember in this context, this is talking about comparing different airspace designs. It says, for communities further away from airports that will not be affected by noise above the levels indicated above, it's important that other aspects of noise are taken into account where the total adverse effects of noise on people between the different options are similar. Metrics must be considered for these purposes include the overall number of overflights, number of above matrices, N65 for daytime noise and N60 for nighttime noise. And then it goes on, you can just sort of read through that. So we should understand, shouldn't we, where you quoted this in your paragraph 6.9, that elsewhere in that document it's recommended the use of LAQs, and it's given us Lowell values, one of which you don't agree with. And secondly, here, the bit that's talking about the use of supplementary matrices is trying to give guidance where the LAQs are very similar, and you're using supplementary matrices to try and distinguish between different options. Would that be a fair summary?
Well, in the context of this document being about airspace design and change, yes.
Yes.
But that's not to say the same principles don't apply to aviation noise as a whole.
You've quoted it. I'm just asking you about it. There's nothing in here, or indeed elsewhere, is there? You can see nothing in ICANN or sonar that indicates that the supplementary metrics are to be used as appropriate metrics for identifying significance of effects. For example,
But there is those documents you do quote show that they should be given weight. And if we go back to the ICANN documents,
Ms. Fiumicelli, with respect, the inspectors have asked me not to interrupt, but they've also asked you to answer the question. And
well, I am answering the question. You just mentioned the ICANN document and asked, was there anything in the ICANN document that would would support the use of supplementary documents? And there is, and I think it's important.
No, that's not what I asked. What I was asking about was whether there was anything in this document or any other document, including ICANN, that indicates that the supplementary metrics are to be used as thresholds for significance, EIA significance of effects. Well,
on that point, where there's anything that says that you should use the LEQ?
That is just another question. Try and answer my question.
Right, it's another question. And I am going to go back to the ICANN document because it is important.
Okay.
You know, page 7, third paragraph, it basically says you need to use a matrix of metrics.
Mr. Fiumicelli, just wait. The rest of us have to get to the document. So it's CD 1047, I think. And which page do you want to take us to?
PDF page 8.
Page 8. Is that PDF page 8 or
PDF page 8, document page 7.
Thank you. And you were going to take us to something that indicated that supplementary metrics are to be used for identifying significance of effects.
I'm taking you to the point that that there is no single unifying metric that you need to use multiple metrics. And the third paragraph is quite, I think, quite clear in expressing how you need to use a range of metrics, and you need to understand how they apply, what their limitations are. They talk about it's in the final paragraph, final sentence of that paragraph.
is this the paragraph that starts, "We do not set out"?
Yes.
Well, we can all read what that says. The using existing long-standing data, that's obviously the very long-standing LAQ data, isn't it? That's what's been used since 1990.
With a clear understanding of what each metric represents, as well as an appreciation for the scope and limitations of the various metrics. So it's,
Yes,
no.
I understand that. I can read the words. But what I was asking you was whether there was any indication that these supplementary metrics are to be used as indicators of significance. So, for example, sols and lols and so on are usually identified in terms of LAQs. Difference criteria are usually identified in terms of LAEQs because they're correlated to certain effects. I'll ask you again, is there anything that you want to point to?
That's a very interesting statement, sir. Can you show me any evidence?
For the
that shows a
Sorry, can you
correlation?
not interrupt Mr. Fiumancelli? Mr. Humphreys was speaking, so if you can just listen to the question and then he'll give you a chance to answer, okay? I can't hear when you both speak over each other, so...
I'm not trying to catch you out. I'm just trying for the inspectors to find out if there is something we should be looking at that indicates that any of these other metrics, apart from helping people understand averaging in LAQ and interpretation, anything that indicates that they are appropriate for identifying significance.
Well, you could say the same thing about any metric. That there is nothing to say that the EIA regulations themselves describe significance in qualitative terms. There are many different ways of measuring and assessing noise. No single metric is ideal. You need to use multiple metrics. There are limitations and advantages to each one, and that needs to be made explicit and clear. There is no explanation within the ES or the ESA for this about the limitations of the use of the LAEQ. It's just presented as a fait accompli. You just suggested that there's some kind of correlation to the degree of change in LAEQ and subjective response. There is none.
Can I interpret that as a no? There is nothing you can point to.
Well, we can go back through my proof where I highlight the various elements of the APF and the air navigation guidance that highlight the need to use metrics other than their LAEQ. The air navigation guidance in particular, I think, is helpful in one respect, in that it makes the point about the metrics and the methods you would use to do the national aviation noise impact assessment, and it's a list of about a dozen different noise metrics, none of which is highlighted as having precedence over any other.
All right. I'm not going to keep asking the same question. Let's move on.
Thank you.
Production of contours. So I'm now just, obviously the contours and the difference data and so on are all produced by the AEDT model, and as you said in your evidence earlier, that's well understood, well used, and there are, I think, two points that you drew attention to, which I'll come to in a moment. One was the Boeing 737 Max and whether it had been the data for Bristol calibrated against recordings, and the second is obviously fleet mix. But subject to that, I believe, indeed I think it's recorded in the Part 2 Statement of Common Ground, that the use of the AEDT software is appropriate.
It is, and it incorporates what used to be called the integrated noise model. It's a very long established piece of software produced by the Federal Aviation Authority in the United States, but it's used all over the world, and it's used for virtually every airport in the UK, except the designated airports that have their own, like Heathrow, Gatwick, Stansted, that have their own dedicated model that the CAA run called ANCON. ANCON is used elsewhere, but then again, the AED, effectively the AEDT was used as sensitivity testing within the Noise Commission at Heathrow, for example.
Yes.
So it's of what's out there. It's long established. Its limitations are understood. It's a useful tool. It's a good tool.
Yes, I don't think anyone is suggesting we need to use ANCON. The CAA use it, as you say, but the FAA have used the integrated noise model and AEDT for a long time now. So we're happy about using AEDT, as I understand it.
Yeah.
Good.
I'm not questioning the use of the model.
And subject to the 2 points that we're going to talk about, which is fleet mix and this one validation point, I think there's no dispute, is there, that the contours produced are correct for the fleet mix that was flown?
Yeah, the output it would be of the model reflects the inputs. Yeah.
This isn't a difficult point, Mr. Fumicelli. I'm just literally trying to make sure that we're, for the inspector's benefit, we've recorded between us that there's no dispute about the type of model or anything else. For the inputs we've used, our fleet mix and numbers of ATMs, the model has correctly recorded the noise at the various locations. That's all I want to make sure we agree.
It has relative to the inputs. I'm sorry to, if some of the inputs are not of a lower level of how can I put it, veracity, if they haven't been validated, there is greater uncertainty with the output. But most of the inputs have been validated.
Yes, and there's one input that you've drawn attention to. This is in your paragraph 694.
Yeah.
Which is uncertainty around the B737 Max, and my understanding is that the point there is that the AEDT model has included the certification data for that very new aircraft, but I think really probably because of the pandemic, it hasn't been, the certification data hasn't been validated at Bristol, and you're identifying that as an area of uncertainty.
Yes, potentially, yeah.
Okay. The inspectors, in a sense, can know in relation to that there are three, I suppose, possibilities, aren't there? One is that the certification data is correct, and therefore the contour size is correct. The second is that actually, in reality, the aircraft is slightly quieter than the certification data, in which case the contours would be slightly smaller. And the third is that the model in practice at Bristol is slightly noisier than the certification data, in which case the contours would be slightly smaller, slightly larger.
Yes.
And come back to that in a moment. The other area of uncertainty you've drawn attention to is in relation to the fleet mix, and you deal with that in your paragraph 6.100. Which is, I think, on page 113. And you have been talking there about, bottom of page 112, top of page 113, you've been talking about different fleet mixes and the Jacobs fleet mix, and you end up by saying, top of page 113, the aircraft could be noisy, in which case the noise contours would be approximately 50% bigger, and more noise-sensitive locations and a greater number of people would be likely to be adversely affected, and significantly adversely affected than presented in the ES and the addendum ES. So in relation to both of those points, both the validation of the Boeing 737 Max and the fleet mix, if the uncertainties produced a larger contour, you say it could be 50% larger, your point is that that would not be consistent with the contour cap.
Well, no, what I'm saying is it's not, if they were 50% bigger, they're bigger, they would cover more area, more people, and the impacts on that basis haven't been assessed.
But there's a contour cap. So they won't be bigger because we'd be in breach of planning condition.
So is the argument there, to simplifying it, that the airport will therefore cut its suit to its cloth? If there's a contour cap of a certain area, it doesn't matter what the fleet mix is, they will always ensure that that contour area is not exceeded.
The airport's proposal, and it's still discussing the conditions with NSC, although I think perfectly properly, because I think a lot of the witnesses were here and giving evidence this week. I think a meeting couldn't be arranged for this week, but the proposal is to have a cap and to have a management system that would report regularly on progress towards that cap. Now, I assume as a generality that's exactly the sort of thing that you would want.
I'd, as part of the conditioning of any permission, I think it's important to also have a cap on the number of air traffic movements that form whatever area the noise contour is.
Yes.
Because of the points I made in my evidence, Chief, of the trading off of imperceptibly less noisy aircraft, significantly more movements could result in the same contour size area.
Yes, but you made the point, didn't you, that, well, there could be a doubling of the ATMs or 66% more ATMs. We all remember that. But of course, there is a passenger cap.
Which can be distributed through a greater number of aircraft.
Yes, but the implication would be the aircraft would be smaller and smaller. If you had twice the number of aircraft, you'd have each aircraft half the size. Mr. Foley gave no evidence that average aircraft sizes were likely to halve, did he?
I don't know. I presume not. No.
No, and therefore, what I don't understand the purpose of an ATM cap where you've got a passenger cap, no evidence that aircraft sizes are going to get smaller, and a contour cap which controls the effect. Because
you can still have what in my view would be a noticeable increase in the number of aircraft. They are imperceptibly less noisy, but you still stay within the overall noise contour area.
Let's just look, you pointed at what the guidance was, the guidance on controlling noise. Can we just look at CD 1013? This is the CAA guidance, aviation strategy, noise forecasts and analyses. And I just,
Yeah.
you dipped into it, but I just want to go to the conclusions. Go to page 66. So it's in a section that starts on PDF page 64, selection of noise limit schemes, and I was taking you to PDF page 66, actual page 66. In summary, the proposed limit schemes consists of nationally set absolute quota limit or noise contour area limit at particular noise levels for both day and night aggregate across major airports, or locally set absolute quota count or noise contour area, a particular noise level for both day and night, and noise monitoring. A, the recommendation is not ATM limits, and B, it's quota count or noise contour areas, and what we are proposing at Bristol for nighttime is in fact a contour area and a QC limit, and for daytime a contour, and that's entirely in accordance with the CAA recommendations, isn't it?
But it doesn't get around the problem of there being an increase in imperceptibly less noisy aircraft and staying within. I mean, arguably the QC count would encourage that. You can have you can have more marginally less noisy aircraft. The noise contour area doesn't change. This is the problem with the QC. The QC relates to the noise emitted by the aircraft, not the noise exposure of those on the ground.
But Mr. Fumicelli, the problem with all of this is that last week in the Council's forecasting evidence, it wasn't forecasting huge numbers of aircraft all being quieter. It was actually forecasting the converse, that aircraft would be, on average, slightly noisier. There's no evidence before the inspectors of huge numbers of super quiet aircraft with, very large numbers of ATMs. That's just not evidence that they have.
Sorry for interrupting. I'm not talking about super quiet aircraft, whatever those are, sir. They don't fly. It's an imperceptibly quieter, less noisy aircraft. That's the problem, because then you can have 25, 30, 40, 50% more of them. It's incredulous that people wouldn't notice those kind of increases in individually noisy events, but your overall contour area could stay the same.
But Mr. Fumicelli, 30, 40, 50% more aircraft with the same number of passengers means 30, 40, 50% less capacity. In other words, smaller aircraft. There's no evidence before us of suddenly aircraft getting much smaller. Had you not thought of this?
That's the physics of how the LEQ and the noise contour area works. There we are.
Of course it is, and if there wasn't a passenger cap, that might be an interesting point to explore. But it has no force in this inquiry, does it, in a context where the passenger numbers are capped?
The passenger cap relates very, very crudely and loosely to any kind of correlation with noise. They could be much bigger aircraft, with fewer of them, but they're a lot noisier.
Mr. Fumicelli, that's why we have a contour cap. That correlates exactly with noise.
No, that's the whole point, in that the contour would not change. If the aircraft were, but if they were noticeably noisier, there might be noticeably fewer of them, but they're noisier.
Now let's move on from this to a slightly different point, see what progress we can make. I'm conscious of time. I think you said about 5 o'clock?
But I mean, we can go on for a little bit long. I think 5:30 is the absolute max.
No, I was hoping to stop earlier.
Okay, well, we can work to 5.
Mr. Fumicelli, I'm going to start a new topic now, and we'll kind of see how far we get, but we won't push this too long. I'm going to just talk about indicators of significance now. So we've talked about metrics. We're now going to talk about indicators of significance, and we're going to talk about two types of indicators of significance, one being absolute levels of noise as per the noise policy statement for England, and the other being change in noise levels as per EIA significance. Okay? Let's start with absolute noise levels, and we've talked a fair bit about lowels and soles. So let's start with lowels. We have used a daytime lowel of 51 dB. So that's 51 dB LAQ 16 hours. And that's based on the document that we looked at before, the consultation response to UK airspace policy. Do you remember we looked at that paragraph?
Mm.
And I think we are, the two sides agreed on that as an appropriate lowel for the daytime.
Yes.
Okay, tick. For nighttime, we have proposed a lowel of 45 dB LAQ 8 hour, obviously, for nighttime. And you are using or suggesting a 40 dB LAQ 8 hour, as I understand it, as the nighttime lowel.
Yes.
I think you base your 40 dB on the WHO night noise guidelines, the 40 dB target that I referred to earlier.
That's part of it, yes.
And is that the target in relation to which Sonar said if one adopted that, you'd close down every bit of transport infrastructure in the country?
If you were to use it as the threshold for closing down every bit of transport infrastructure in the country, if you were to use it as low, as being which is the threshold at which you aim to take reasonably practical measures to mitigate and minimise, yeah. That doesn't mean shutting down the airport.
Okay. The 45 dB that we have used, as we discussed, was based on that consultation response to UK airspace policy. Let's look at it again. We touched on it in a different context, but it's CD 1043. Um, 1043 in paragraph 2.72, and that makes one quite interesting point correction, which we sort of touched on earlier. It says we will set the lowel of 51 for daytime based on feedback and further discussion with CAA. We're making one minor change to the lowel night metric to be 45 dB LEQ 8-hour rather than the L night to be consistent
Yeah.
with the daytime metric. And that is the LOL that the CAA use, isn't it, for nighttime?
Yes.
The LOL of 45 dB nighttime was also the one that was used, adopted, approved, whatever you want to say, in the Stansted Airport decision, wasn't it?
I don't recollect the detail, but if that's the case, sir, and you say so, yes.
Well, I can give the reference, and perhaps we don't need to look at it, but then the inspectors can check it. So it's CD 6.13, paragraph 36. The SOL, the daytime SOL, we've used 63 dBA, 16-hour, and that figure again I think is agreed by you. That's not.
Yeah, I'm not disputing that the value of that metric as being a SOL. Yeah.
Yeah, the nighttime SOL, we've used 55 dB LAQ 8-hour. Searching through your written evidence, you didn't propose a figure, but in your evidence in chief, you, unless I misheard or misunderstood, appeared to propose a nighttime SOL of 50 dB.
Yes, I mean, there's been the sonar study that came out relatively recently, I think has a very clear step change threshold around 50 decibels, certainly below 55. And also, I think there's a need to take into account the generally lower ambient background noise levels at night in the wider district that's affected by noise from the airport.
If it wasn't for background noise, would you be adopting 55 dB?
Not necessarily. Now that we've got the evidence from the SONA 2021, the 55 dB from the World Health Organization noise guidelines, as I say, it's explicit in the guidelines. It's what they regard as the onset of cardiovascular effects. The 50 dB that I would derive from the SONAR 2021 is to do with sleep disturbance. So it's two different effects, although they're both health effects. And you're more likely to get sleep disturbance in terms of the exposed population. You know, the rate at which you would have cardiovascular effects is much, much lower than sleep disturbance.
If we look at the WHO report, just to understand this, so this is the WHO Night Noise Guidelines 2009, so CD 10.44.
Yeah.
And you turn to table 3, that's PDF page 19.
Yeah.
And you look in that table at the above 55 dB, situation is considered increasingly dangerous for public health. Adverse health effects occur frequently. Sizable proportion of the population is highly annoyed and sleep disturbed. There is evidence that the risk of cardiovascular disease increases. That's, of course, very close, isn't it, to the description in the noise hierarchy for the level above Seoul?
Yes, there are similarities. The executive summary that we went to earlier, in my evidence, I think in my evidence in chief, when we had the Roman numerals, what was it? XV1, the last paragraph specifically says that above 55 dB, the cardiovascular effects become major public health concern. There's obviously going to be sleep disturbance, because they say sleep disturbance starts, the onset of that is around about 40 decibels.
Yes.
55 low. So 55 is bigger than 40. You are going to get, there will be sleep disturbance. But the choice of 55 as an interim target is largely because of it's the they regard it as onset of cardiovascular effects.
So we're getting at that level, which is describing similar things to the noise hierarchy table for Seoul. But that's precisely one of the reasons why Mr. Williams has adopted 55 dB as the Seoul.
But things have changed in that we now have the evidence of the sonar 2021 of a big step change in the percentage of people reporting are being highly sleep disturbed around 50 decibels.
Yes, but just to be clear, because you've relied on WHO, in fact, the WHO guidance, Table 3, actually supports the Seoul being set at 55 dB.
But there are other elements, both within the night noise guidelines, where it says it hasn't taken into account the relationship with background noise, and then there's the explicit statement within the WHO community noise guidelines that you need to take into account a lower threshold for sleep disturbance in low background noise level situations.
And if we want to get an idea of the levels proposed in relation to expansion of other airports, if we take up Mr. Williams' proof of evidence, and we go to his table 5, which is on page 42, we can see that with one exception, 55 dB 8-hour LEQ has been adopted for all those expansion projects. The one exception was Stansted 54 dB, but none of them support the figure that you've, in your evidence in chief, introduced, 50 dB. There's no there's no policy or other guidance or indeed experience in UK airports of applying that figure, is there?
Yeah, well, these are all applications. I'm not sure these are the actual numbers that were used as thresholds in the decision-making process. Certainly, the Luton 2001. That's in play. That's certainly not been ratified. I'd also question the other airports being in locations where there was a substantial, if not a majority, of the area that we would class as having low background and ambient noise levels.
But a lot of these airports, Stansted is largely rural. Manston is largely... Stansted
is very close to and roughly in line with the M11, isn't it, as well?
It is close to the M11. I obviously do have some experience with that airport, and I do remember people around that airport trying to argue the tranquility point because it was an airport that was relatively remote from large built-up areas, or at least the overflights were not over large built-up areas.
yeah, correct. But I mean, there is evidence in the original environmental statement. There were baseline noise measurements made at a dozen or so locations in the within the spatial scope of the study for the ES for Bristol, and other than close to the A38, for example, in most of those locations, those numbers are at the bottom end of what you would expect to find on average across the UK. They're in the low 50s in the day and the low 40s at night.
You do make,
location.
You do make this point about rural airports. Are you able to point to any airport expansion projects in rural locations that have used significantly lower nighttime LAEQs?
No, but I'm saying that the evidence has shifted because of the information we now have from the somewhat delayed release of the sleep disturbance information for the Sonar 21 sleep disturbance study, which shows a step change, in effect, a doubling of those who report sleep disturbance. It goes from about 8% to just over 16% at around 50 decibels. It then sort of plateaus through 55 to 60.
Let's, on that point, then look at the original Sonar report, which is 10.9, CD 10.9. And turn to PDF page 62. Para 717, we can see there makes the point, third sentence, in particular, when approximated social grade, presence of double glazing and urban-rural classification were included together, only approximated social grade remains statistically significant, with double glazing and urban-rural classification being not significant.
Well, that's in relation to daytime effects, isn't it? That's not in relation to nighttime. Thought we're discussing the nighttime solve.
Yes, it is, but there's nothing there that indicates that a rural location overall is having a material effect. There's no evidence in support of your proposition.
Yeah, there is. There's a specific study by Fidel, which looks at this, and it shows that you predict annoyance and sleep disturbance by looking at the relationship between your aircraft noise level and the underlying ambient noise level at a location, done by simply looking at how loud is the aircraft noise.
Let's look at other studies to try and see if this effect has been picked up. Let's look at the WHO community guidelines, so CD 10.1. So in that document you need to look at PDF page 30, and this is one where there is a big difference between PDF page numbers and actual page numbers, because there are a lot of Roman numeral pages at the front. So PDF page 30 and paragraph 2.3.4. The WHO said a number of studies have suggested that the annoyance effect of particular noise would depend on how much that noise exceeded the level of ambient noise. This has been shown to be true for noises that are relatively constant in level, but has not been consistently found for time-varying noises such as aircraft noise, because at some time during an aircraft flyover, the noise always exceeds the ambient noise. Responses to this type of noise are less likely to be influenced by the level of ambient noise. So again, insofar as bodies have looked at this, that there's no finding of a strong correlation here between a noise effect and low ambient noise.
Well, the Fidel study that I mentioned a moment ago is from 2013. 13 years after the World Health Organization anti-noise guidelines were published, there is evidence to show that you get a better, you're better able to predict response by looking at the relationship between the aircraft noise level and the ambient noise, and solely by looking at absolute noise levels on its own. That, for its time, World Health Organization was true, but evidence and research has moved on since then, and there is an effect. That document as well, the World Health Organization Community Noise Guidelines, in relation to nighttime effects of sleep disturbance, does actually specifically state that in low noise environments, in low background noise environments, you need to lower further the thresholds that you would use. Their recommended guidelines should not be used in the environments where there is a particularly low background or ambient noise level at night.
Yes, but obviously the inspectors will know the nighttime sols and the nighttime lols are lower than daytime, reflecting that is a quieter period of the day. The point I'm putting to you is that there's no there's no guidance to us that those levels that are recommended, whether it be in the consultation response on the airspace change or anywhere else, that tells us that this is different if these are rural airports, as many of them are.
But the MPSC is explicit in saying there's no single possible way of describing this, and that I'm paraphrasing now, but I haven't got it in front of me. And also the MPPG develops on this and lists various factors you need to take into account in developing appropriate lows or sols to the particular circumstances that you're addressed with. And one of the things it says you look at is the relationship to the existing noise climate.
All right. Final point in this section, and then subject to what the inspectors tell me, it may be that then we break. We touched on this earlier. I think we can probably deal with it very, very quickly. We've talked about lols, we've talked about sols, the UAEL, which we've put at 69, you've not agreed that, but I don't think there's any suggestion that there are any receptors above that threshold level where we would have to remove people.
In the context of that metric, I don't think there are, but I think we need to be careful, because there can also be a UL, a sleep disturbance. Yeah.
Mr. Fumicholi, just pause for a moment. Madam, as far as I'm concerned, that's quite a useful stopping point. I can go on if you want to, but I think you'd originally said about 5 o'clock, and so that's what I've aimed for.
Okay, yeah, no, I'm content to finish there. Obviously, we'll restart back tomorrow with the rest of the cross-examination. Yes. I mean, Mr. Fumicholi, you are obviously in isolation anyway.
Yes.
So I'm less worried about you overnight in that case, but yeah, okay, thank you. Any procedural matters to deal with before we finish for the day?
I don't think so, not from my point of view.
No, okay, great. Well, we shall adjourn until tomorrow then at 9:30. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.